There are moments in history when a single act, small in scale but vast in consequence, sends ripples across centuries, bending the course of human events like a stone cast into a still pond. Picture this, a quiet monastery under the cover of night, a shadowy figure slipping through the cloisters, and the sudden absence of something sacred. What might seem like a simple theft becomes the spark that ignites a firestorm of vengeance, betrayal, and legend. This isn't just a story about a stolen relic. It's a saga of how one act of defiance unraveled into a century-long spiral of retribution, weaving itself into the very fabric of mythology and power. The relic at the heart of this tale wasn't just an object. It was a symbol of faith, a vessel of divine connection, and a prize coveted by kings and thieves alike. Its disappearance didn't just anger a few monks, it shattered alliances, fueled wars, and inspired tales so potent they blurred the line between history and legend. Why does this story still resonate? Because it's a mirror held up to human nature itself, our capacity for devotion and deceit, our hunger for justice and revenge, and the way we spin myths to make sense of the chaos we create. So let's step into the shadows of medieval Europe, where the lines between truth and folklore are as thin as parchment. We'll follow the trail of this relic, from its theft to the blood feuds it inspired, from the whispered rumors that grew into epic sagas to the surprising ways its legacy still lingers today. This is more than a history lesson. It's an exploration of how one act of greed or defiance can echo through time, shaping cultures, forging legends, and reminding us that the past is never truly buried. Ready to uncover the secrets of a theft that changed history? Then let's begin. The relic at the center of this storm was no ordinary treasure. It was a fragment of the true cross, said to hold splinters from the very wood on which Christ was crucified. Encased in gold and jewels, it had been carried across Europe by crusading knights before finding its final resting place in the Abbey of Saint Denis, just outside Paris. For generations, pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to kneel before it, believing its touch could heal the sick or absolve sins. Kings swore oaths upon it, and wars were paused in its presence. To possess it wasn't just about power, it was about holding a tangible piece of the divine, a direct line to heaven's favor. But why did this particular relic inspire such devotion? In medieval Europe, objects like these weren't just symbols, they were thought to radiate holiness, acting as conduits for miracles. The fragment was said to have bled during a siege, saving the abbey from invaders. It reportedly glowed in the presence of saints. These stories weren't mere superstition. They were the bedrock of faith, politics, and identity. When the relic vanished on a moonless night in the year 1387, it wasn't just a theft, it was an insult to God, a challenge to royal authority, and a crisis that would divide nations. The shockwaves were immediate. The King of France declared the theft an act of sacrilege, offering a fortune for its return. Rival lords were accused of orchestrating the crime to undermine the crown. Peasants whispered that the relic's absence had brought famine and plague. In monasteries across the continent, scribes recorded visions of saints weeping over its loss. But the most fascinating twist, the thief left no trace, no broken locks, no witnesses, just an empty reliquary and a lingering question: who would dare and why? The answer would unravel a web of ambition, betrayal, and a revenge plot that spanned lifetimes. The night it disappeared was one of those hushed, oppressive evenings where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The Abbey of Saint Denis stood silent, its towering arches and flickering candles casting long shadows across the stone floors. The relic, secured behind iron grates and watched over by a rotating guard of monks, should have been untouchable. But someone had studied its defenses, learned the rhythms of its keepers, and chosen this night to strike. The details that survived are sparse but chilling. A single monk, Brother Henry, later claimed to have seen a figure draped in black moving like smoke through the cloisters. No alarms were raised, no doors were forced. By the time the dawn light revealed the empty reliquary, the thief or thieves had vanished without a trace. The only clue, a single white rose left on the altar, its petals still damp with dew. To the monks, this wasn't just a taunt, it was a signature. Roses were the symbol of a noble house locked in a bitter feud with the French crown, the Dukes of Lorraine. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the Duke's youngest son, a disgraced knight exiled for heresy, had orchestrated the theft as revenge against the king who'd stripped his titles. Others whispered of mercenaries hired by a rival kingdom, hoping to weaken France's divine favor. But the boldest theory, that the relic had been taken not for greed but for prophecy. An obscure manuscript from the era speaks of a legend that whoever controlled the fragment in the year 1399 would wield power unmatched by sword or crown. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The king's men ransacked noble estates, searching for the relic. Peasants, fearing divine punishment, abandoned their farms to pilgrimage to empty shrines. And in the shadows, something darker took root, the first threads of a revenge plot that would outlive its architects, because this wasn't just a crime to be solved. It was a gauntlet thrown, a wound that festered, and the opening move in a game where the stakes weren't just land or gold, but the very soul of a kingdom. What made the theft so explosive wasn't just the act itself, but what it represented. In an age where faith and power were inseparable, stealing a relic was like stealing a piece of the throne. The message was clear: if even God's favor could be snatched away in the night, no ruler was safe, and that was a provocation that could only be answered in blood. The king's response was as swift as it was merciless. Within days of the relic's disappearance, the royal army descended upon the lands of the Duke of Lorraine, burning crops and laying siege to his ancestral castle. The justification was clear. This was no mere punishment, but a holy reckoning. The king's heralds proclaimed that God himself had withdrawn his favor from France, and only the blood of the guilty could restore it. The Duke, caught off guard, swore his innocence, but oaths meant little when the scent of treason hung in the air. His youngest son, the exiled knight rumored to have masterminded the theft, was declared an outlaw, his likeness nailed to church doors with a bounty that would make a peasant rich for life. But the true spark that lit the fire of vengeance came not from the battlefield, but from the pulpit. The Archbishop of Reims, enraged by the sacrilege, stood before a trembling crowd in Paris and pronounced a curse upon the thief and all who sheltered him. With the relic gone, he declared, France stood naked before God's wrath. Plague, famine, and defeat would follow until the fragment was returned. The people believed him. Panic spread like fever. Neighbors turned on neighbors, accusing one another of harboring the thief or profiting from his crime. In one village, a traveling merchant was torn apart by a mob who mistook his foreign accent for guilt. The Duke's retaliation came not with armies but with whispers. From his besieged castle, he sent letters to every noble house in Europe, painting the king as a tyrant who'd invented the theft to seize land. He even dared to suggest the relic had never been stolen at all, that the king had hidden it himself to justify his purges. These words, scribbled on parchment and smuggled past enemy lines, were more dangerous than swords. They planted doubt where there had been unity, turning allies into skeptics. And then, the unthinkable. In the dead of winter, the Duke's forces ambushed a royal supply train, slaughtering the guards and leaving their bodies arranged in a mocking crucifixion pose. Attached to one corpse was a note written in what looked like blood. "You took my honor, I take your peace." The message was unmistakable. This was no longer about the relic if it ever had been. This was personal. What began as a hunt for a sacred object had spiraled into something darker. A feud where every atrocity demanded a crueler answer, where the original crime was all but forgotten beneath the weight of fresh grievances. The king ordered the duke's remaining sons imprisoned. The duke responded by burning 3 royal villages to the ground. Back and forth it went, each act of vengeance digging the wound deeper, until even those who'd once clamored for justice began to whisper that the cycle had to end. But cycles like these rarely end by choice. They need something or someone to break them. And as the years wore on, the missing relic became less a holy object than a ghost haunting both sides, a symbol of all they'd lost in its name. The irony was bitter. The very thing meant to unite a kingdom had become the reason it tore itself apart. The fragile web of alliances that had held medieval Europe together began to unravel like a frayed rope under too much strain. With a relic's absence stripping the French crown of its divine legitimacy, lesser nobles saw an opportunity to rewrite the rules of power. The Duke of Burgundy, once the king's most trusted advisor, abruptly withdrew his troops from a joint campaign, citing divine signs that France had lost heaven's protection. In truth, his spies had intercepted letters suggesting the king suspected him of aiding the thieves, a slight he couldn't forgive. Meanwhile, the Count of Flanders, whose daughter had been promised in marriage to the king's son, publicly broke the betrothal, declaring no union could be blessed while the relic remained missing. The insult was deliberate. By tying the broken engagement to the theft, he framed his betrayal as piety rather than ambition. But the most shocking defection came from within the church itself. The Bishop of Chartres, long a vocal supporter of the king, secretly funneled church gold to mercenary bands harassing royal supply lines. When confronted, he didn't deny it. Instead, he quoted scripture about rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, implying the king had forfeited his right to rule. This wasn't just rebellion, it was a theological revolution. If clergy could withdraw their support, what stopped peasants from doing the same? The chaos created opportunities for those who thrived in shadows. Mercenary companies, once hired to patrol trade routes, now played both sides, selling their swords to the highest bidder. The White Company, a notorious band of Italian condottieri, even spread rumors they'd recovered the relic, not to return it, but to auction it to rival factions. Their leader, a cunning strategist named Lorenzo the Fox, allegedly boasted, "Kings pray for miracles, but we sell them." Yet the most unexpected player to emerge was a woman, Yolande of Aragon, the teenage queen consort of a minor kingdom to the south. While others fought over scraps of power, she quietly brokered alliances with merchant guilds, securing loans to rebuild towns destroyed in the fighting. Her letters reveal a startling perspective she called the relic a distraction, arguing that true stability came from fed mouths and sturdy walls, not gilded splinters. Though dismissed by most nobles as naive, her influence grew where it mattered most, among the people. The relic's absence didn't just create a power vacuum, it exposed the cracks in an entire system. What began as a holy theft became a mirror, revealing how quickly loyalty crumbles when fear replaces faith. And as the conflict spread, drawing in opportunists and idealists alike, one truth became clear: the longer the fragment stayed lost, the less anyone remembered what they were fighting for in the first place. As the years passed and the relic remained lost, something curious happened. The stories about it grew larger than the object itself. Whispers in taverns spoke of a wooden fragment that wept blood in the hands of thieves, its crimson stains refusing to wash away. Pilgrims returning from ruined battlefields claimed to have seen it hovering above the smoke, glowing with an unearthly light. A traveling minstrel song spread like wildfire, telling of a bandit who stole it only to drop dead moments later, his last words a confession scribbled in his own blood. Whether these tales held truth mattered less than their power. They turned a physical object into something alive, a force with its own will. The church, desperate to maintain control over the narrative, fueled the mystique. A papal decree declared that anyone sheltering the relic would suffer the fate of Judas, their name erased from history. Monks penned illuminated manuscripts depicting angels striking down those who touched it without pure hearts. But the most potent stories came from the people themselves. In one village, a drought ended the day. A mysterious traveler left a rose on the church steps, the same white rose found at the original theft. Coincidence to a starving farmer, it was a sign. The relic wasn't just missing, it was watching, judging, testing the faithful. Nobles seized on the mythology for their own ends. The Duke of Lorraine's surviving son, now a grizzled mercenary captain, circulated rumors that the relic had chosen him as its guardian, granting him visions of victory. His enemies scoffed until he won 3 battles against impossible odds. Even skeptics hesitated. What if the stories were true? The fear was so palpable that when a fire destroyed a rival lord's treasury, survivors swore they'd seen the Duke's banner reflected in the flames. Truth blended with terror until no one could separate them. Yet the darkest legends surrounded those who sought the relic for greed. A famous ballad told of a wealthy merchant who tracked it to a mountain cave, only to find the skeletons of previous seekers, their gold still clutched in bony fingers. The relic sat untouched on an altar, and when the merchant reached for it, the cave collapsed, all except the path back, as if something had spared him to spread the warning. Whether fact or fiction, the message was clear. This wasn't treasure to be owned. It was a test, and tests, as history shows, often reveal more about those who take them than the answers they seek. The myths didn't just grow around the relic, they became a mirror, reflecting the fears and hopes of an entire era. For peasants, it was divine justice. For kings, a lost cornerstone of power. For thieves, a reminder that some things carry curses heavier than gold. With every retelling, the line between the artifact and its legend blurred further, until the very idea of its return became less about reclaiming an object and more about restoring a world that had slipped into shadow. But legends, once unleashed, are hard to contain. And the most chilling story of all, the one that still echoes in scholarly debates today, wasn't about the relic's power, but its absence. A cryptic note found in a dead monk's journal reads, "What if it was never stolen? What if it left?" To understand why the theft of this relic sent shockwaves across kingdoms, we need to step into the medieval mind, a world where heaven and earth weren't separate realms, but intertwined layers of reality. For scholars of the time, relics weren't just symbols, they were physical conduits of divine power, as vital to a ruler's authority as their armies or treasuries. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that holy objects retained a fragrance of the eternal, acting as bridges between the mortal and the divine. A king who possessed a relic didn't just own a piece of history, he held proof that God favored his reign. This wasn't mere superstition. Relics anchored entire economies. Take the Abbey of St. Denis, where our stolen fragment once rested. Pilgrims flocked there by the thousands, spending coin on food, lodging, and offerings, wealth that funded everything from cathedral construction to royal coffers. When the relic vanished, so did the pilgrims, leaving towns destitute. Chroniclers of the era wrote of innkeepers starving and local markets collapsing, their despair as much spiritual as economic. The theft didn't just rob a church, it unraveled a delicate web of faith and commerce that sustained entire regions, but the deepest fear was cosmic. Medieval thinkers saw the world as a fragile balance between order and chaos. where sins like sacrilege could tip the scales toward divine wrath. When floods or plagues followed the relic's disappearance, priests didn't call them coincidences, they were punishments. A sermon from the era warns, as a limb severed from the body rots, so too does a kingdom cut off from God's grace. This wasn't metaphor. To rulers, the relic's absence meant their very land was spiritually adrift, vulnerable to invasion, famine, or worse. Political calculus was brutal. A rival lord might hesitate to challenge a king who could brandish a relic in battle, claiming angels fought beside him. Without it, suddenly, rebellion seemed survivable. The Duke of Burgundy's betrayal wasn't just opportunism, it was cold logic. If heaven had withdrawn its favor, why pledge loyalty to a sinking ship? Yet relics also held a paradox. They were both unifiers and weapons. The same fragment that inspired pilgrims to journey in peace could be paraded before armies to justify slaughter. Its theft didn't just create a power vacuum, it removed the ultimate trump card, the one object that could silence dissent with a whisper. Do you dare risk God's wrath? What's chilling is how modern this all feels. Strip away the gold and the Latin, and you're left with a lesson about power's fragile foundations. Then as now, legitimacy isn't just about laws or force, it's about the stories people believe. And in 1387, the story was simple. Without that splinter of wood, the world itself felt broken. No wonder they fought so viciously to reclaim it, or to ensure no one else could. Among the many who sought to reclaim the lost relic, none burned with such singular purpose as the Brotherhood of the Sacred Blade, a secretive order of warrior monks who called themselves God's Hounds. Once a quiet sect devoted to copying manuscripts, the theft transformed them into something darker. Clad in robes stitched with verses from Revelation, they carried not quills but broadswords, their scabbards engraved with a single question: what will you give for heaven's treasure? Their leader, a gaunt former bishop named Arnulf, preached that the relic's absence was a test, a chance to prove faith through fire. His sermons, delivered atop smoldering battlefields, twisted scripture into a rallying cry. The Lord did not spare his own son. Why should we spare his enemies? Under his command, the Brotherhood's campaigns became pilgrimages of blood. They stormed castles rumored to shelter the thief, leaving no stone unturned, and often no survivors. When challenged about their brutality, Arnulf would produce a tiny vial of ash, claiming it held the dust of Sodom. Mercy, he'd whisper, is what drowned the world before the flood. Yet the most chilling detail wasn't their violence, but their meticulous record-keeping. Each raid was documented in illuminated ledgers, blending accounting with apocalypse. One page might list seized gold alongside a psalm. Another would tally dead heretics next to a sketch of the relic's imagined hiding place. These books reveal the Brotherhood's true obsession. They weren't just hunting an object. They were reconstructing a divine puzzle, convinced each act of violence brought them closer to solving it. Their tactics blurred the sacred and the profane. Before battle, they anointed their swords with holy water. Prisoners were given a choice: confess the relic's location, or recite the Lord's Prayer while a monk timed them with an hourglass. Too slow, and the sand became their funeral rite. Rumors spread that the Brotherhood had begun seeing signs in everything. A farmer's crooked fence became a map, a child's rhyme a coded message. Even their allies grew uneasy. A Venetian envoy wrote home in cipher, "They do not seek the fragment, they seek to become it." And then, in the winter of 1402, the Brotherhood vanished. No battles, no final stand, just an abandoned fortress, its walls covered in charcoal sketches of the relic, each one more distorted than the last. On the altar lay Arnulf's sword, snapped in two, and a single word scratched into the stone: enough. Whether they'd found what they sought or finally seen the cost, no one could say. But their legacy endured in the stories of a relic that didn't just inspire devotion, but devoured it. While kings and monks waged holy wars over the missing relic, another world moved in silence, one where sacred objects weren't vessels of faith, but commodities traded in shadowed courtyards and smoke-filled taverns. For every true believer desperate to reclaim the fragment, there were a dozen opportunists who saw only its weight in gold. The theft hadn't just sparked a spiritual crisis, it had unwittingly created the medieval equivalent of a black market boom, where authenticity mattered less than audacity. Forgers worked tirelessly to meet demand. In the back rooms of Parisian workshops, artisans aged wood with vinegar and rubbed it with dirt to mimic centuries of veneration. One particularly brazen scheme involved a merchant who sold certified slivers of the true cross, each no larger than a grain of rice, to nobles across Europe. When questioned, he'd produce a parchment supposedly signed by a cardinal, though the ink was still damp. The ruse lasted until a buyer noticed the ancient wood smelled faintly of oak ale. But the real players were the middlemen smugglers who trafficked in whispers. A network of riverboat captains and traveling minstrels moved not just relics, but information about them, selling leads to the highest bidder. The going rate for a credible tip about the stolen fragment, enough to buy a small estate. Some brokers even staged elaborate scams, planting false relics in abandoned chapels and hiring actors to play miraculous witnesses. One such scheme nearly provoked a war when a forged fragment was discovered in the lands of a rival lord, prompting accusations of sacrilege. The church fought back with decrees and dire warnings, but greed proved stronger than fear. A jailed forger's confession, recorded in the margins of a trial manuscript, captures the era's chilling pragmatism. If men will pay for hope, who am I to deny them? Yet the most sinister effect of this trade wasn't the fakes. It was how they muddied the waters of truth. Every counterfeit fragment that surfaced cast doubt on the real one's eventual return. After a while, even genuine miracles were met with cynical laughter. A chronicler of the time lamented, "We have reached the age where gold outshines grace." And so the relic's absence birthed a paradox. The more desperately people sought it, the less they believed it could ever be found. The black market didn't just profit from the chaos, it became a self-perpetuating engine of distrust, ensuring no resolution could ever feel certain. In the end, the forgers and thieves did more than peddle lies. They made the very idea of truth feel like just another commodity. The forgery surfaced in the spring of 1405, carried into Paris on a velvet cushion by a trembling priest who swore he'd found it hidden in a hollow oak near the German border. Its arrival should have been a moment of jubilation. The lost relic finally returned, but something felt off. The gold filigree was too shiny, the wood beneath suspiciously light. When the king's archbishop lifted it to bless the crowd, a gasp rippled through the square. The relic's famed miraculous weight, said to make even strong men stagger, felt no heavier than a loaf of bread in his hands. The truth unraveled quickly. A goldsmith's apprentice, sweating under interrogation, confessed to crafting the fake under orders from a shadowy patron, a lord who'd promised him land in exchange for something convincing enough to buy time. Time for what? The answer came weeks later when soldiers stormed the lord's estate and found letters revealing a chilling strategy. He'd hoped the counterfeit would sow enough confusion to weaken the king's claim to divine favor, leaving his rivals room to rebel. But the damage ran deeper than politics. For ordinary believers, the forgery was a spiritual gut punch. If even priests could be fooled, how could they trust anything sacred? Peasants who donated their last coins to see the recovered relic now spat at church doors, calling all clergy frauds. Pilgrimage routes, once bustling with faithful, emptied overnight. A chronicler in Rowan wrote, "Men who once crossed themselves at the sound of bells now laugh at the mention of miracles. The factions hunting the real relic turned on each other with fresh venom." The Duke of Lorraine's supporters accused the king of planting the fake to discredit them, while royal spies circulated rumors that the Brotherhood of warrior monks had crafted it as part of some deranged test. The more accusations flew, the clearer it became no one cared about truth anymore. They cared about winning, and then came the twist no one anticipated, a second forgery. Then a third. By the decade's end, Europe had become a carnival of holy counterfeits, each more elaborate than the last. A Venetian con artist sold certified relic fragments inside lockets that played hymns when opened, until buyers realized the music came from tiny clockwork birds. In England, a fraudulent bishop authenticated a fragment by staging its miraculous levitation over an altar, exposed when a stagehand's pulley snapped mid-performance. The real tragedy wasn't the fakes themselves, but what they did to the search. Every new fraud made the genuine relic seem less like a sacred object and more like a myth. Scholars began to question whether it had ever existed at all. The very idea of holiness became negotiable, something measured in craftsmanship rather than faith. And in that shift, the thief, whoever they'd been, achieved something far beyond theft. They didn't just steal a relic, they stole the world's ability to believe in it. The king's move came not with a sword, but with parchment and ink. Faced with a realm fracturing under the weight of doubt, he made a decision that would rewrite the rules of power. If the relic couldn't be found, he would become the relic. His advisors balked when he ordered the construction of a new reliquary, empty, but draped in cloth of gold and placed atop the high altar of Notre Dame. "Let them see what they need to see," he reportedly said. On the day of its unveiling, thousands gathered, expecting a miracle. What they got was theater. As the bishop lifted the veil, sunlight struck a hidden mirror, flooding the cathedral with blinding light. The crowd fell to their knees, weeping. No one dared ask if the fragment was inside. The spectacle itself was the message. Divine favor had returned, and it wore the king's face. But the true masterstroke came weeks later, when he announced a grand procession to reconsecrate the empty reliquary across the war-torn countryside. Chroniclers recorded villages starving and divided, yet when the gilded chest passed, former enemies knelt together in the dirt. The king's men spread rumors. A blind girl had glimpsed angels circling the cart. A withered tree had bloomed in its shadow. These weren't just stories, they were currency traded to rebuild loyalty. Even the Duke of Burgundy, his most formidable rival, hesitated to attack a monarch who seemed to command the skies. Yet the gamble had a fatal flaw. The more the king tied his legitimacy to the relic's myth, the more he needed it to stay lost. When a drunken soldier bragged in a tavern that the procession was a fraud, the king's spies silenced him, but not before the words had spread. Whispers turned to murmurs. If the king could fake divine light, what else was a lie? The very spectacle meant to unite the kingdom became proof of its rot. And then came the letter, delivered by a hooded courier to the royal chambers. It contained no threats, no demands, just a single line of scripture. For nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest. Folded beneath it, a sliver of wood, old enough to be ancient or expertly aged. The king's hands shook as he held it. After years of manipulating the relic's legend, had the real thing finally surfaced? Or was this another player's move in a game where faith and power shared the same poisoned cup? The answer would force him to confront a truth more dangerous than any theft. You can't wield a myth without it eventually wielding you. The first flames of rebellion flickered to life not in a noble's hall or a king's council, but in the muddy lanes of a starving village. For years, peasants had endured the wars, the purges, the empty promises. all while their children's bellies swelled with hunger and their fields lay trampled under the boots of passing armies. They'd been told the relic's return would bring God's mercy, but as the years dragged on with no miracle, no justice, their patience curdled into something darker. Whispers spread like wildfire. If the king couldn't recover heaven's favor, perhaps he never had it to begin with. The spark came from an unlikely preacher, a one-eyed shepherd named Martin who claimed angels spoke to him in his dreams. Standing atop an overturned cart in the market square of a ruined town, he didn't quote scripture, he screamed it. The fragment wasn't stolen by men, he roared, but taken by heaven itself. A sign that the mighty have fallen from grace. His words struck like lightning. If the relic had abandoned the powerful, then true holiness must lie elsewhere with the poor, the humble, those who'd suffered longest. By sundown, the crowd had torn down the local lord's tax records and strung them from a tree like rotten fruit. What followed wasn't just a revolt, it was a reckoning. Peasants armed with scythes and rusted swords marched under banners stitched with crude images of the lost relic, declaring themselves its true guardians. They burned manor houses not as thieves, but as inquisitors purging the land of corruption they believed had driven the fragment away. A captured bailiff's diary records their chilling refrain. No king, no duke, no bishop can hide from the judgment of the empty reliquary. The elite's shock was palpable. Chronicles from the era describe nobles barricaded in their castles, staring bewildered at mobs who no longer feared divine punishment. One count wrote to his brother, "They do not riot for bread, but for the very keys to heaven, and they believe we've lost them." The church's threats of excommunication, once enough to quell dissent, now drew laughter. A group of rebels in Flanders even stormed a monastery, not to loot, but to hold their own mass before the altar, proclaiming that God spoke through the hungry now. Yet the cruelest twist was how the rebellion consumed itself. Without a clear enemy or goal, the movement fractured. Some bands turned to banditry, justifying theft as God's redistribution. Others, convinced the relic's return required blood sacrifice, began hunting suspected witches. The same fervor that had united the desperate now splintered them into warring factions, each convinced they alone knew heaven's will. By the time royal troops crushed the last pockets of resistance, the revolt had left a scar no victory could erase. The peasants had proven something terrifying to those in power. That faith, once weaponized by the desperate, could burn hotter than any army. And though their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, their legacy lingered in the hushed conversations of every marketplace and alehouse. If holiness could slip from the hands of kings, perhaps, just perhaps, it belonged to the people all along. When the relic vanished and the kingdom's misfortunes mounted, fear turned inward toward neighbors, strangers, anyone who might carry the taint of the divine's displeasure. At first, the accusations were whispers: a midwife whose remedies worked too well, a widow who kept to the woods, a girl with mismatched eyes who spoke in riddles. But as crops failed and children sickened, those whispers became screams. The relic's absence wasn't just a theft, it was a curse, and curses demanded witches to blame. The most infamous case began in a village near the German border, where a traveling friar claimed to have seen the devil's mark on a local herb gatherer named Mathilda. Her crime, predicting a storm the day the relic was stolen, a coincidence twisted into proof of collusion. Under torture, she confessed to impossible things, flying over the abbey that night, stealing the fragment with her bare hands, even hiding it inside a hollow tree that bled when struck. Her execution drew crowds who crossed themselves as the flames climbed her skirts, convinced her death would break the curse. When the rains came that evening, they called it a miracle. When the drought returned a week later, they found another witch. Records from the era reveal a chilling pattern. Trial documents list accusations like shopping lists. A baker's bread turned moldy witchcraft. A cow's milk ran red witchcraft. Even the relic's empty reliquary was said to grow hot to the touch in the presence of the guilty. The logic was circular and unshakable. If holiness had fled, its opposite must have taken root. And so the hunt spread, fueled by a desperation to pin the kingdom's unraveling on something, or someone tangible. But the true horror lay in how these trials became a perverse shadow of the relic's original purpose. Where the fragment had once been a conduit for divine grace, the witch pyres became altars of inverted faith, their smoke carrying prayers for vengeance instead of mercy. A bishop's private journal confesses his unease. We burn women to light the way back to God, yet the darkness only deepens. The cruelest irony, many of the accused were the very people who'd once tended the relic's cult. Old women who'd woven tapestries of its miracles found themselves accused of weaving spells instead. A young nun who'd claimed visions of the fragment's return was paraded through the streets as a fraud, her holy ecstasy recast as demonic possession. Even the white rose left at the theft, once a noble family's symbol, was now proof of a witch's pact, its petals counted like a devil's tally marks. By the time the fever broke, hundreds had perished, not at the hands of invaders or rival lords, but their own neighbors. And the relic still missing. The trials hadn't restored divine favor. They'd only revealed how easily faith could twist into fanaticism when fear outran hope. In the ashes of the pyres, a question lingered, too dangerous to speak aloud. If the witches hadn't stolen the fragment, had God let it be taken? And if so, what did that make the burnings? The ink-stained hands of medieval scribes held more than quills. They held the power to reshape reality. As the relic's disappearance spiraled into decades of conflict, chroniclers faced an impossible choice: record the chaos as it unfolded, or mold it into something that served their patrons. The result was a tapestry of contradictions, where the same events could appear as holy crusades or butchery, depending on whose scriptorium you stood in. Take the Royal Chronicles of Paris, commissioned by the French crown. Their pages gleam with righteous fury, painting every battle as a divine reckoning. One passage describes the king's siege of a rebel stronghold as angels scattering the unworthy like chaff, glossing over the starvation of trapped civilians. Yet cross the border into Lorraine, and a ducal scribe's account calls that same siege a king's hunger for innocent blood, omitting the rebels' massacre of surrendered soldiers. These weren't just differing perspectives, they were competing truths, weaponized to justify atrocities. The most striking divide emerges in how they framed the relic itself. Church-affiliated chronicles insisted its theft had unleashed hell on earth, linking every flood and famine to the crime. But a handful of dissenting voices, like the anonymous monk who penned the Book of Silent Sorrows, dared to ask uncomfortable questions. His fragile manuscript, hidden for centuries in a Bavarian monastery, suggests the relic's cult had grown corrupt long before its disappearance, that perhaps its loss was not heaven's punishment, but its mercy. Propaganda wasn't subtle. A Burgundian chronicle describes the Brotherhood of warrior monks as saints clad in steel, while a Venetian trader's diary calls them madmen who mistook slaughter for sacrament. Even dates diverged. Some annals stretched the relic's absence to 50 years to magnify the kingdom's suffering, while others compressed it, as if minimizing the crisis could hasten its resolution. Yet the most enduring legacy of these conflicting accounts isn't their bias, it's how they birthed the myth we know today. When later historians tried piecing together the truth, they didn't find a single narrative, but shards of stories that could be arranged to suit any agenda. The victors didn't just write history, they buried its alternatives under layers of vellum and vitriol, until the line between what happened and what needed to be believed dissolved entirely. What survives is a paradox. The closer we look, the clearer it becomes that the relic's true power wasn't in its wood or gold, but in its absence, a void that let every faction see their own reflection. The chroniclers knew this. Some even hinted at it between the lines in smudged ink and cautious metaphors. They understood that when facts become faith, the only thing left to record is the weight of what's missing. Art has always been the silent keeper of lost things, preserving what history forgets in pigment and stained glass. Long after the relic vanished from its reliquary, it lingered in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, tucked into cathedral frescoes, even woven into the very tapestries that adorned noble halls. These weren't just depictions, they were coded messages, prayers in color and light. Take the famous Apse of the Absent, a fresco hidden in a remote Tuscan chapel. At first glance, it shows Christ on the cross, surrounded by mourning saints. But look closer. Where the cross's base should meet the ground, there's only empty space. A gap painted with such precision that worshippers swore they could see straight through to the chapel wall. The artist, a monk known only as Brother Theodoric, left notes confessing his intent. To show what is missing is to make the missing holy again. Stained glass offered another language of absence. In the great cathedral of Chartres, a rose window designed decades after the theft depicts a radiant crucifixion scene, yet the cross itself is crafted from clear glass, invisible unless the sun strikes it at just the right angle. On overcast days, parishioners knelt before what seemed an empty glow, a literal window into the void. Some wept, believing the effect was miraculous. Others accused the glaziers of heresy, but the truth was subtler. The artisans were capturing a paradox. How do you show something that's gone? By making the light itself the relic. Then there were the more clandestine symbols. Tapestries commissioned by the Duke of Lorraine's descendants wove the white rose, the thief's calling card, into scenes of the Annunciation, tiny and pale among the lilies. In one, the rose rests at the Virgin's feet, its stem snapped as if plucked in haste. Was it a boast, a confession, or a plea for forgiveness? The weavers took their secrets to the grave. But the most haunting tribute wasn't in grand cathedrals. It was in the humble. Folk artists painted the relic on village church walls with cheap pigments that flaked away year by year, mirroring its disappearance. In some villages, children played a game called Find the Fragment, tracing their fingers over fading murals, pretending to discover what their grandparents had lost. What's startling is how these artworks transformed the relic's meaning. No longer just a stolen object, it became a mirror for longing, a way to grieve not just the fragment itself, but the certainty it once represented. Every empty reliquary in art, every shadow where the cross should be, whispered the same unsettling question: is holiness in the object or in the space it leaves behind? By the 16th century, the relic's legend had bled into myth. Albrecht Dürer sketched it as a radiant blur held by a faceless thief in his dream of the sacred thief. Caravaggio supposedly painted a boy holding a splintered plank, a street urchin posing as divine irony. Even the brushstrokes seemed to tremble with the weight of the unspoken, that some things are more powerful when lost than when found. Perhaps that's why the art outlasted the politics, the wars, even the memory of the theft itself. These images weren't just records, they were rituals. To depict the missing was to keep it present, and in that paradox, the relic achieved a kind of immortality, no longer wood and gold, but an idea that could never be stolen again. The year 1431 dawned with exhaustion. After 4 decades of bloodshed and broken oaths, even the most fervent warriors had forgotten the taste of peace. Then came the storm, not of swords but of water. The great flood of that spring swallowed entire villages along the Rhine, drowning allegiances beneath its muddy tide. Nobles who'd spent lifetimes at each other's throats now huddled together on rooftops, passing the same wineskin. A bishop's chronicle from the era captures the surreal truce. Men who'd sworn to kill one another wept as they pulled children from the same current. In the flood's aftermath, something shifted. The Duke of Lorraine's grandson, a bookish man who'd never swung a sword, proposed an unthinkable summit. Not to negotiate lands or titles, but to mourn. He invited the French king's envoys to a stripped-bare hall in Metz, its walls still streaked with waterlines. No banners, no jewels, just two wooden chairs facing an empty pedestal where the relic might have stood. "We've fought so long over heaven's favor," he said, "that we forgot to tend the earth beneath our feet." The gesture was so startlingly human that even hardened diplomats faltered. But the true turning point came from an unexpected quarter. A group of merchants, tired of seeing their trade routes burned, financed a pilgrimage to Rome, not to beg the Pope's intervention, but to commission a replacement. The new fragment, crafted from olive wood grown in Gethsemane, bore no resemblance to the lost relic. Its power lay in its honesty. A plaque at its base read, "Not the original, but a pledge to rebuild." When it toured the war-torn regions, crowds didn't kneel. They wept. For the first time, someone had acknowledged the unspeakable truth that the past couldn't be recovered, only honored. Yet not all scars could heal with symbolism. The Brotherhood of the Sacred Blade's surviving members, now old men, emerged from hiding to denounce the false relic as blasphemy. Their last public act was to burn it in the square of Strasbourg, only for the townsfolk to salvage the charred remains, calling them holier for having burned. Even in defiance, the Brotherhood had unintentionally given the people a new kind of relic, proof that some fires purify rather than destroy, the final stroke of irony. The very next year, a shepherd boy stumbled upon a rotted chest in a collapsed cave near the original abbey. Inside lay a gold reliquary, its hinges rusted shut. By the time the king's examiners pried it open, the wood within had crumbled to dust, unidentifiable, unverifiable. After decades of wars fought over its absence, the relic's possible return became a footnote. The factions had already moved on, not because they'd found what was lost, but because they'd finally learned to live with the loss. The treaties signed that era avoided grand declarations. They spoke of road repairs, shared mills, and the return of stolen church bells, ordinary things that knit lives back together. Only one clause hinted at the deeper reconciliation, a mandate that every All Saints' Day, the white rose of Lorraine and the fleur-de-lis of France would be woven into a single garland and laid upon the empty altar at St. Denis. Not to mark an ending, but to tend the space between what was taken and what remained. Among the countless voices lost to time, one soldier's words survived, scrawled in faded ink on parchment so fragile it crumbles at the edges. Sir Guy de Montfort, a knight who fought in the bloodiest campaigns of the Relic Wars, penned a letter to his sister on the eve of what he called a battle with no saints left to pray to. His account doesn't boast of glory or divine favor. Instead, it aches with a weariness that transcends centuries. "I write this by firelight, though the flame is too weak to warm my hands. We buried 20 men today, boys. Really, their faces still soft beneath the dirt. The chaplain says God wills it, but if that's so, then heavens will taste like cold porridge and sounds like coughing blood." I once believed we fought to return the fragment to its rightful place. Now, I'd trade every relic in Christendom for one honest voice to tell me why we're still killing. His words peel back the layers of grand historical narratives, exposing the raw nerve of individual suffering. He describes a skirmish near Rheims where his company ambushed a supply train only to find it carried not weapons but bread for starving villagers. The guilt clung to him like damp armor. We burned the carts anyway. Orders. That night, I dreamt the missing relic floated above the flames, not weeping but laughing. When I told the priest, he crossed himself and said dreams are the devil's work, but whose work is the waking world? Even more revealing are the marginalia, tiny sketches between the lines. A crooked tree with a noose, a child's shoe trampled into mud. These weren't illustrations, they were silent screams. In one corner, he doodled the white rose of Lorraine, its petals numbered like a tally of battles survived. By the 10th petal, the ink smudges as if his hand had shaken too violently to continue. Monastic scribes preserved the letter not for its heroism, but as a caution. A note attached centuries later reads, "Let this stand as witness not to the cost of losing holiness, but of seeking it with knives." Sir Guy's final line, written after a decade of war, cuts deepest. "If you ever find the fragment, sister, leave it be. Some things are better lost than bloodied." His words remind us that behind every clash of kingdoms, there were hands that trembled, voices that broke, and souls that wondered if the cause they bled for was ever worth the wounding. Long after the treaties were signed and the battlefields grew quiet, the relic refused to stay buried not in the earth, but in the imagination of those who'd lived through its shadow. Villagers along the old pilgrimage routes swore they saw a golden glow moving through the forests at dusk, always just beyond reach. A shepherd in the Vosges Mountains claimed to find footprints in the snow that led to an empty clearing, the air thick with the scent of roses in dead winter. These weren't just stories, they were a collective haunting, a way to make sense of the unfillable void the relic had left behind. Some communities turned the absence into ritual. In the Alsace region, children would leave wooden crosses by their doors on the anniversary of the theft, hoping to lure the fragment home like some sacred stray. In Lorraine, maidens wove crowns of white roses and cast them into rivers, whispering, "Return when the world is worthy." The most poignant tribute came from a ruined abbey near Reims, where monks too old to remember the relic's face still set an extra place at their meager table each evening, a silent invitation to the divine guest they feared might never return. But not all echoes were gentle. The relic's legend curdled in places where the wars had burned hottest. Parents in the Black Forest warned disobedient children that the shard of the lost cross would carve their names next to Judas's if they lied. A traveling puppeteer's show featured a skeletal thief whose stolen relic turned to venomous serpents in his hands, a morality play that drew gasps even decades later. The fragment had become a shapeshifter, to some, a ghost of lost grace, to others, a monster under the bed of history. The most striking transformation, though, was how the relic wove itself into the fabric of collective memory. Annual fairs that once celebrated its miracles now hosted competitions to craft the most convincing replica, not as forgeries, but as acts of communal healing. Winning carvers received not gold, but the right to burn their creation in a ceremonial pyre, its smoke carrying prayers for reconciliation. Even the white rose, once a symbol of division, became something new. Brides in border towns began stitching it into their veils alongside the fleur-de-lis, a quiet rebellion against the old hatreds. Perhaps the truest testament to the relic's enduring grip was how it haunted those who'd sought it most fiercely. An aging duke's diary confesses that in his dreams, the fragment always lay just beyond a doorway that shrank each time he reached for it. A former Brotherhood monk, now a blind beggar, would tap his cane on cathedral steps and tell passers-by, "Holiness isn't in what we hold, but in what holds us." By the time the Enlightenment dawned, scholars dismissed the relic as superstition, yet it persisted in the spaces between logic. Weather vanes in Flanders still turned inexplicably toward St. Denis on windless days. Honeybees in Burgundy formed uncannily cross-shaped hives. And in the year 1789, when revolutionaries ransacked the royal archives, they found a yellowed parchment labeled "The Thief's Confession." The page was blank, save for a single rose petal, brittle as ash. Some say it crumbled at the touch, others insist it dissolved into light. Centuries may have passed, but the allure of that missing relic still pulses like a heartbeat beneath the soil of modern Europe. Today's treasure hunters arrive not with torches and broadswords, but with ground-penetrating radar and spectral imaging, scouring the ruins of St. Denis Abbey or the caves of Lorraine for any trace of the fragment that once held kingdoms hostage. In 2019, a team of Belgian archaeologists made headlines when they uncovered a hidden compartment beneath a medieval chapel, empty, but lined with lead to block X-rays, as if someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide something. The discovery reignited old debates. Was this proof the relic had been moved deliberately, or just another dead end in a trail colder than the stones themselves? What's fascinating isn't just the persistence of the search, but how it's evolved. Cryptographers now pore over centuries-old manuscripts, not for battle plans, but for coded clues. One amateur historian in Munich swears he's cracked a pattern in the Duke of Lorraine's personal ledger entries, spaced at intervals that match the distances between known hiding spots of other stolen relics. Meanwhile, a tech startup in Paris uses AI to analyze medieval art for hidden symbols, convinced the white rose motif appears too frequently to be coincidence. Their theory, the thief left a trail in plain sight, knowing only future generations would have the tools to follow it. Yet the most compelling searches aren't just about technology, they're about obsession. Take Klaus Richter, a retired schoolteacher who spent 30 years tracing every rumor of the relic's survival. He'd show up at remote monasteries with nothing but a backpack and a dog-eared copy of a 15th century diary, asking to inspect crypts or cellars. In 2012, he vanished near the Swiss border, leaving behind a notebook filled with sketches of tunnels that locals swear don't exist. Authorities called it a hiking accident. Treasure hunters whisper he got too close. So why does this splinter of wood still captivate? For some, it's the thrill of solving history's ultimate cold case. For others, it's the chance to touch something transcendent, to bridge the gap between faith and proof. But perhaps the real answer lies in what the relic represents. Not just a lost object, but a lost moment when the divine felt tangible enough to steal. Modern hunters aren't just chasing gold or glory. They're chasing the echo of a time when heaven and earth collided, and the haunting possibility that somewhere, in some forgotten corner, they still do. And every now and then, the past teases its pursuers. In 2021, a construction crew renovating a Vienna cathedral pried open a medieval wall niche and found a single white rose preserved in beeswax, its petals perfectly intact. No relic, no explanation, just a whisper from the shadows, as if the thief were still one step ahead. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist in 1990 wasn't just another art theft. It was a modern echo of that moonlit raid on St. Denis Abbey 6 centuries earlier. Under the cover of darkness, 2 men dressed as police officers bound the guards and spent 81 minutes methodically stripping the walls of masterpieces worth $500 million. Among their targets, not just paintings, but a rare Chinese bronze beaker from the Shang dynasty, a relic in its own right. The parallels are uncanny, the precision of the theft, the brazenness of the act, and most strikingly, the way the stolen objects took on mythic weight in their absence. Just like the medieval fragment, these artifacts became more than art. They became questions, obsessions, voids that demanded filling. What connects these crimes across 600 years isn't just the thrill of the steal, but what the stolen objects represent. The Gardner thieves ignored easy-to-sell modern pieces. opting instead for works like Vermeer's The Concert, a painting so singular, so irreplaceable, that its loss left a wound in the art world. Medieval chroniclers would have recognized the choice instantly. It's the same logic that drove the thief to take the true cross fragment instead of the abbey's gold. Some things are valuable precisely because they can't be replaced. Their power lies in their uniqueness, their cultural DNA. Steal a Rembrandt, and you're not just taking a canvas, you're stealing a piece of collective identity, a landmark in humanity's story. But the deeper symmetry lies in the aftermath. Just as the medieval relic's absence fueled wars and witch hunts, the Gardner theft birthed its own legends. Theories abound. The mob used the paintings as collateral. They were destroyed to cover tracks. They're hidden in an Irish castle. Even the FBI's $10 million reward hasn't broken the case. Sound familiar? It's the same silence that followed the white rose left at St. Denis, a taunt that turns thieves into specters and victims into detectives doomed to chase shadows. The most chilling parallel, though, is how both thefts expose the fragility of the systems built around these objects. The Gardner Museum's security flaws, no motion sensors, guards untrained for emergencies, mirror the medieval abbey's unforced errors. In both cases, institutions trusted too much in the sanctity of their walls, forgetting that devotion can be a vulnerability. Faith, whether in God or in technology, makes us drop our guard. And that's when the thieves walk in. Yet here's the twist. While medieval Europe tore itself apart searching for its lost relic, the modern world has turned the Gardner heist into a kind of macabre performance art. Podcasts dissect every lead, documentaries frame the thieves as anti-heroes, and the empty frames still hang in the museum like altars to absence. We haven't stopped venerating relics, we've just secularized the ritual. The stolen Vermeer is our splinter of the true cross, the FBI's wanted posters our papal decrees. Even the motives blur across time. Was the Gardner theft about money? Revenge, or the same twisted desire to hold beauty hostage that drove some medieval nobles to hoard sacred bones. Perhaps the only real difference is the scale of the curse. The medieval relic's disappearance poisoned a continent, but the Gardner theft lingers as a quieter, more intimate haunting. Its victims aren't kingdoms, but art students who'll never see the storm on the Sea of Galilee in person. Conservators who weep over digital scans of the empty frames. The violence is subtler but no less profound, because when you steal something irreplaceable, you don't just take an object, you steal the futures it might have inspired, the prayers it might have answered, the moments of awe it might have sparked. That's the true lesson of these echoes across time. Relics, whether sacred or secular, are mirrors. They show us what we value, what we fear to lose, and how far we'll go to reclaim ghosts. And sometimes the most dangerous thing about them isn't their power, but what happens when that power slips into the wrong hands or vanishes entirely, leaving us to reckon with the emptiness left behind. The question of who truly owns the past isn't just about stone and gold. It's about memory, power, and the stories we choose to preserve. Take the case of our missing relic. If it were discovered tomorrow in a private collection or a foreign museum, would it belong to the French abbey where it was stolen, to the nation that claims cultural heritage over it, or to the world as a shared piece of history? There's no easy answer, and that tension reveals the fault lines beneath every debate over stolen artifacts. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a curator at the Louvre, frames it this way. Objects like these exist in a paradox. They're tied to specific places and peoples, yet their meaning transcends borders. A 12th century French peasant and a modern Buddhist monk might experience the same relic in utterly different ways, but both encounters are valid. That duality fuels the conflict. When Greece demands the Parthenon marbles back from Britain, or Nigeria seeks the Benin bronzes from German museums, they're not just asking for objects, they're reclaiming sovereignty over their own narratives. But preservation complicates the picture. Professor James Whittaker, a heritage conservationist, points to the fragility of medieval artifacts. Many relics survived because they were taken. War, climate, and neglect have destroyed countless treasures left in situ. He cites the Vatican's secret archives, where Crusader-era documents are meticulously climate-controlled, conditions unimaginable in their places of origin at the time. Does safety justify displacement, or does it echo the colonial logic of "we know better"? The ethical lines blur further when private collectors enter the equation. In 2018, a billionaire purchased a stolen Byzantine manuscript at auction, then quietly returned it to a monastery in Cyprus. Was this restitution or publicity? The monks welcomed it home but bristled at the donor's name engraved on the cover. Even acts of goodwill can carry the stain of appropriation. Perhaps the most poignant perspective comes from communities directly impacted. In a documentary on looted sacred objects, a Navajo elder whose tribe recovered a stolen ceremonial mask put it simply, "You can't heal a wound while the knife is still in it." For cultures where relics are living entities imbued with spirits or prayers, their return isn't about ownership but restoration. A French peasant in 1387 might have understood that better than any modern lawyer. Yet the counterarguments persist. Universalists argue that scattering artifacts across museums fosters global understanding. The British Museum's defense of its collection hinges on this, that seeing a Rosetta Stone in London or a Moai statue in Paris expands horizons. But critics fire back. You don't need to own something to share it. Digital reconstructions, traveling exhibits, and cultural exchanges offer alternatives that don't require permanent possession. The relic's shadow looms over all these debates. Its absence became a canvas for projection of nationalism, of divine wrath, of collective guilt. Maybe that's the cruelest irony. The longer it stays lost, the more it reveals about what we value. Not wood or gold, but the right to say this is ours. And in that struggle, the past becomes less about what happened than who gets to tell it. So where does that leave us? With more questions than answers, can justice ever be retroactive? Can preservation justify theft? The relic won't solve these dilemmas, but its silence speaks volumes. Perhaps the real lesson isn't who owns history, but how often history owns us. The Stolen Relic's journey didn't end with history. It slipped into the realm of fiction, where its legend grew wilder, darker, and infinitely more malleable. Think of the Da Vinci Code's frantic chase for holy secrets, or Indiana Jones grappling with artifacts that blur the line between divine and dangerous. These stories owe a debt to medieval relics like ours, but they've twisted the template into something new, a playground where faith and conspiracy collide. The real fragment of the true cross might have vanished, but its fictional cousins thrive, feeding our hunger for mysteries where every shadow hides a revelation. Take the name of the rose, Umberto Eco's masterpiece of monastic intrigue. Beneath its labyrinthine plot lies a truth medieval scribes knew well. Sacred objects aren't just plot devices, they're mirrors reflecting our deepest fears. Eco's forbidden book, like our relic, becomes a MacGuffin that exposes the rot beneath piety. Modern audiences eat it up because the stakes feel familiar. Replace the Abbey's secret manuscript with the lost fragment, and you've got the same recipe. Knowledge so potent it could topple empires, guarded by those who'd kill to keep it hidden. Video games, too, have weaponized the relic's legacy. The Assassin's Creed series spins entire narratives around artifacts that grant godlike power, echoing the medieval belief that holding the true cross fragment made kings invincible. In Dragon Age Inquisition, the protagonist literally seals a holy breach in the sky, a plotline that wouldn't feel out of place in a chronicle about the relic's disappearance causing divine wrath. These stories tap into an ancient anxiety that losing a sacred object doesn't just deprive us of a treasure, it unravels the cosmic order itself. Yet the most fascinating transformations happen when the relic's mythos bleeds into horror. The Relic, yes, that's the actual title, a schlocky 90s monster flick, turns a sacred South American statue into a vessel for a flesh-eating curse. It's a far cry from medieval miracles, but the underlying fear is identical. That holiness, when corrupted, becomes a weapon. Even the Blair Witch Project plays with these tropes. The unseen, malevolent force haunting the woods mirrors the relic's absence as a lingering curse. The message is clear: some voids demand sacrifices, but why does this template endure? Because it's elastic. The relic can stand in for any ideological battleground, religion, science, even capitalism. National treasure turns a treasure hunt into a patriotic rite. The Ninth Gate makes rare books the keys to summoning the devil. The details change, but the core remains. We're still chasing fragments of meaning in a world that feels increasingly fractured. The irony, these fictional relics often become more real to audiences than the historical ones. Ask a random person about the Knights Templar, and they'll cite Dan Brown before any Crusader chronicle. The White Rose left by our thief has inspired more RPG side quests than academic papers. That's the power of myth. It doesn't just outrun fact, it rewrites the finish line. So next time you watch a hero dodge traps to grab some glowing artifact, remember, they're walking a path paved by medieval monks, mercenaries, and monarchs who believed a splinter of wood could hold the weight of heaven. The names and special effects have changed, but the hunger remains. And perhaps that's the real relic, not the object, but our endless need to believe it's out there, waiting to be found. In 2018, a team of archaeologists sifting through the ruins of a long-abandoned monastery in the French Alps made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the historical community. Nestled beneath the foundation stones of a collapsed chapel, they uncovered a lead-lined box, the kind typically used to preserve sacred relics. Inside, instead of wood or gold, lay a brittle parchment, its ink faded but still legible. The document, dated to the year 1406, bore the seal of a forgotten monastic order known as the Keepers of the Missing. Its contents: a confession, or perhaps a boast. The text, painstakingly translated from medieval Latin, recounts how the order's founder, a disgraced knight turned hermit, orchestrated the relic's theft not for personal gain, but as a dagger to the heart of kings who mistook power for piety. Most explosive was the claim that the fragment had been smuggled out of France entirely, hidden in plain sight within the luggage of a Byzantine diplomat returning to Constantinople. If true, this would rewrite centuries of speculation, shifting the search from European cathedrals to the vaults of ancient empires. Modern technology has given the hunt new life. Dr. Isabel Morau, the lead archaeologist on the Alpine dig, used multispectral imaging to reveal hidden passages in the parchment's margins, coordinates that match trade routes linking medieval France to the Levant. This wasn't just a theft, she explains. It was a meticulously planned exile. They didn't steal the relic to possess it, they stole it to erase it. Yet the past resists easy answers. Skeptics point out that the Keepers of the Missing left no other records, and their monastery's location, perched on a treacherous mountain pass, suggests isolation, not influence. Could this confession be an elaborate hoax planted by later generations to taunt the crown? Radiocarbon dating confirms the parchment's age, but as historian Dr. Thomas Renard cautions, authenticity doesn't guarantee truth. Medieval forgers were just as skilled as modern ones, perhaps more so, with eternity at stake. The most tantalizing clue lies in the document's cryptic closing lines. Where the rose wilts in foreign soil, the root remains. For treasure hunters, this has sparked a frenzied re-examination of Byzantine-era artifacts in Istanbul's museums. In 2021, a Turkish conservator noticed something odd about a nondescript reliquary in the Topkapi Palace collection. Its base contained a hidden compartment, empty but lined with flecks of wood that matched the true cross's purported cedar. The discovery reignited debates. Was this the relic's final resting place, or just another way station in a journey without end? Science offers tools our medieval counterparts couldn't imagine. DNA analysis of the wood fragments, neutron activation testing to trace their mineral composition, even AI-assisted comparisons of the parchment's handwriting to known scribes of the era. Each method peels back another layer of the mystery. But as Dr. Morau admits, technology can tell us where something's been, not why it matters. The relic's true power was never in its material, but in the stories it carried. And so the search continues, now spanning continents and disciplines. Satellite imagery scans alpine passes for hidden tunnels. Archivists scour Venetian trade logs for mentions of suspicious cargo. A team in Cyprus recently uncovered a 15th century fresco depicting a golden reliquary aboard a ship, its sails emblazoned with white roses. Coincidence? Or the next piece of the puzzle, the past guards its secrets like a dragon hoarding gold, sometimes yielding a glint of treasure, but never the full hoard. Whether this parchment is the key to the relic's fate or another riddle wrapped in time, one truth remains: some stories refuse to end. They simply change shape, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And perhaps that's the most enduring legacy of all, not the fragment itself, but the endless human need to chase its shadow. Standing in the shadow of St. Denis Abbey today, you can still trace the ghostly outline of where the relic's reliquary once stood, a vacant niche in the stone, worn smooth by centuries of fingertips brushing its edges in quiet reverence. This isn't just a tourist stop. It's a wound in the architecture, a physical absence that pulls you backward into the story. Visitors often describe an uncanny sensation here, as if the air itself hums with the weight of what's missing. Some leave handwritten prayers tucked into the crevices, modern echoes of medieval desperation. The abbey's caretakers have learned not to clear them away too quickly. These notes, like the relic itself, seem to exist halfway between memory and myth. For those willing to venture beyond Paris, the ruins of the Duke of Lorraine's stronghold near Metz offer a stark contrast. Crumbling towers claw at the sky, their stones scorched black in places where royal forces finally broke through. It's easy to imagine the Duke's grandson pacing these battlements, watching for messengers who might never come. Local guides love to point out the rose window, a jagged hole in the chapel wall where, if you stand at dawn on the summer solstice, the light paints a perfect white bloom on the opposite stone. No one knows if it's coincidence or some long-dead architect's silent rebellion, but it's become a pilgrimage for artists and historians alike. Down in the Alsace region, the story takes a quieter turn. The village of Eschau boasts a modest museum dedicated not to the relic, but to the ordinary lives disrupted by its theft. Here, you'll find tax records showing how pilgrim traffic dried up overnight. A child's wooden toy carved from a pew that was sold when the church went bankrupt. Even a handwritten recipe for famine bread made with acorns and bark. These artifacts hit differently. They remind us that behind the grand narratives of kings and curses, Real people starved and hoped and grieved. But perhaps the most haunting stop lies in the Swiss Alps, where the keepers of the Missing's monastery clings to a mountainside like a crumbling swallow's nest. Reaching it requires a hike up a treacherous path, the same one the Brotherhood used to vanish without trace. Inside the roofless chapel, frost has painted delicate crosses on the walls, nature's ironic tribute to the fragment they swore to erase. Visitors who brave the climb often speak of an overwhelming silence here, broken only by the wind whistling through empty niches where reliquaries once sat. It's not the grand absence of St. Denis, but something more intimate, the sound of a secret kept too well. For those craving tangible connections, Istanbul's Topkapi Palace offers a tantalizing maybe. The reliquary with the hidden compartment sits unassumingly in a corner of the sacred artifacts collection, its plain exterior belying the storm of speculation around it. Crowds rush past it to gawk at jeweled daggers and emerald-studded thrones, but occasionally someone will stop dead, staring at those flecks of wood as if they might suddenly rearrange into answers. The museum labels it neutrally, container, origin uncertain, but the way guards keep a close eye on it suggests they know its power to mesmerize. What binds these sites together isn't just shared history, but the emotions they evoke in those who seek them out. There's the prickling sense of walking where desperate men once plotted, the ache of running your hand over stone worn smooth by generations of vanished pilgrims. Some visitors come as skeptics and leave unsettled. Others arrive devout and depart with more questions than faith, but no one leaves unchanged. Because standing in these spaces does something no textbook can. It turns whispers from the past into something you feel in your bones, a chill that has nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with time's uncanny ability to collapse when you're standing where history held its breath. The relic's true power never lay in the gilded case or the splinter of wood it housed. It lived in the collective gasp of pilgrims who knelt before it, in the trembling hands of kings who swore oaths upon it, in the desperate prayers whispered into its absence. This is the philosopher's riddle at the heart of our saga. Was the fragment of the true cross holy because it was touched by the divine, or because centuries of belief had woven divinity into its very grain? Consider the dichotomy. On one side, the materialists' medieval scholars like Peter Abelard, who dared to question whether relics truly channeled God's power or merely reflected human longing. They pointed to the thriving trade in counterfeit fragments, the way identical, nail from the true cross relics appeared in dozens of cathedrals. How could all be genuine? Yet their skepticism often drowned in the tide of popular devotion. A peasant who'd seen a withered limb straighten after touching the reliquary didn't need philosophical debates. Their truth was written in flesh and bone. Then there were the mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, who saw relics as portals, physical objects that bridged the seen and unseen worlds. To them, the relic's power wasn't in the wood itself, but in its ability to focus faith like sunlight through a lens. When the fragment vanished, it wasn't just an object that was lost, but a focal point for millions of prayers, a rupture in the ritual rhythm of an era. Modern archaeology offers a fascinating lens on this divide. Scientific analysis can date wood, trace gold's origin, even identify the species of a rose left behind, but it can't measure the weight of a collective sigh when a hope is dashed. The lead box found in the Alps might contain a forgery's confession, but does that parchment's ink hold less power because it's not divine? The keepers of the missing certainly didn't think so. Their act of theft wasn't just about removing an object, it was about dismantling a narrative, proving that faith could be as fragile as the relic's brittle edges. Perhaps the most poignant perspective comes from the rebellion's aftermath. When peasants wove white roses into their bridal veils or burned replicas in ceremonial pyres, they weren't mourning wood or gold. They were grappling with something far more profound, the realization that holiness had always been a collaboration between the sacred and the seeker. The relic didn't make miracles, it gave people permission to believe in them, and that's the ultimate twist in our tale. The fragment's absence didn't disprove its power, it revealed it. Like a silhouette cast by firelight, the relic's influence grew sharper in the void it left behind. Wars were fought, art was made, lives were appended, not because of what the object was, but because of what it represented. A truth as old as humanity itself: we don't worship relics, we worship the stories they let us tell about ourselves. So when archaeologists dust off another lead box or historians decode another cryptic parchment, they're not just chasing an artifact. They're chasing the echo of a question that outlasts empires. Does belief need an object to make it real, or is the object just an excuse for the belief to begin? The answer, like the relic itself, may forever hover just beyond our grasp. The relic's tale isn't just a dusty page from a medieval chronicle, it's a reflection staring back at us across the centuries, forcing us to confront an uncomfortable truth: we haven't outgrown the hunger for sacred symbols. Look around today, and you'll see the same patterns playing out in galleries, courtrooms, and even online battlegrounds. When protesters hurl soup at a van, go to protest oil drilling, or when nations spar over the repatriation of ancient artifacts, we're witnessing the same primal dance of possession and meaning that once set kingdoms ablaze over a sliver of wood. The stakes may wear modern clothes, copyright lawsuits instead of crusades, hashtags instead of papal decrees, but the heartbeat beneath them is eerily familiar. Take the ongoing tug of war over the Elgin marbles. Greece's demand for their return isn't just about reclaiming marble, it's about healing what they see as a spiritual wound, much like medieval peasants believing famine would lift only when their relic was restored. The British Museum's counter-arguments, preservation, universal access, echo the medieval church's claims that sacred objects belong to all Christendom. Both sides are wrestling with the same question: who gets to define what's sacred? And then there's the digital age's twist on relic culture. Viral conspiracy theories spread like wildfire because they function as modern-day relics, fragments of secret truth that promise to make sense of chaos. A QAnon devotee clinging to cryptic posts isn't so different from a 14th century monk scouring scripture for clues to the fragment's whereabouts. Both are chasing the euphoria of revelation, the sense that possessing hidden knowledge sets them apart from the gullible masses. But here's the hopeful difference: we have tools our ancestors lacked. Forensic science can authenticate artifacts without bloodshed. Social media can amplify marginalized voices instead of burning them as witches. The real test isn't whether we'll stop valuing symbols. We're human, we always will. But whether we can learn to hold them more lightly. To fight for justice without dehumanizing opponents, to cherish heritage without weaponizing nostalgia. The relic's journey, from divine conduit to political pawn to ghost story, reminds us that power lies not in objects, but in the stories we wrap around them. And stories, unlike gold or wood, can be rewritten. So the next time you see a crowd gathering around some new holy grail, whether it's a cryptocurrency or a reclaimed statue, ask yourself, what hunger does this truly feed? And what would happen if we redirected that energy toward the living, breathing world beyond the glass case? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The question is whether we'll keep chanting the same old verses or dare to compose new ones. If this journey through the shadows of the past has left you grappling with these echoes, drop your thoughts below. And for more expeditions into the tangled roots of our present, hit subscribe. The past isn't done with us